They told her Americans would strip her naked, parade her through the streets, and leave her to freeze. That's what every woman in Nazi Germany was taught. So when Greta Muller felt the first drops of rain that April night in 1945, she prepared to die of exposure. She was a prisoner. She had no rights, no dignity, no hope. But then she heard footsteps approaching through the mud. An American guard. This was it. The humiliation, the cruelty she'd been promised. Instead, she felt something warm settle over her shoulders. His coat. His own coat. And in that moment, everything she believed about the enemy shattered like glass. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The field was nothing more than torn earth and mud, transformed overnight into a temporary holding camp for prisoners. It was April 18, 1945, and Western Germany was collapsing under the weight of the American advance. The war that Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was ending in its 12th, and the evidence of that ending lay scattered across every mile of landscape. Barbed wire fencing had been erected hastily around the perimeter, posts driven into soft ground at angles that spoke of urgency rather than precision. Canvas tents sagged in uneven rows, their olive-drab fabric already stained with mud splatter from boots and rain. In the distance, the skeleton of a German town rose against the darkening sky. A church spire leaned at an impossible angle, its top half simply gone. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls intact but their insides hollowed out by fire and explosives. Smoke still drifted from some structures, lazy gray columns that merged with the low clouds. American military vehicles were parked in neat rows along the camp's eastern edge. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, all painted the same flat green, all bearing the white star that marked them as belonging to the conquerors. Searchlights on tall poles cut through the gathering dusk, their beams sweeping across the compound in regular intervals. Guard towers stood at each corner, hastily built but functional, with armed sentries visible as silhouettes against the sky. The sound of generators hummed constantly, a mechanical heartbeat that powered the lights, the radios, the machinery of occupation. The air smelled of wet earth, that deep, mineral smell that comes when rain is coming and the ground is already saturated. Mixed with it was the sharp scent of diesel fuel from the idling vehicles, the acrid smell of canvas treated with waterproofing chemicals, and underneath it all, the smell of too many unwashed bodies pressed together. 300 German prisoners had been processed through this camp in the last 2 days. Most had already been moved to larger facilities, but some remained, waiting for transport, for paperwork, for decisions to be made about their fate. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening came on. It was only 45 degrees Fahrenheit, cold for April but not unusual for northern Germany. The wind picked up from the north, carrying with it the promise of rain. The sky had been gray all day, but now the clouds were darkening to charcoal, heavy and low. The first drops began to fall just as the searchlights came on, fat drops that made dark spots on the pale canvas tents and turned the dusty ground darker still. Greta sat on the bare earth near the perimeter fence, her back against a wooden post, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had been sitting there for 4 hours, ever since the processing officer had told her to wait in this section for tent assignment. The camp was overcrowded. Women were being processed more slowly than men. She would have to wait. She had nodded, understanding. What choice did she have? She was 28 years old, but she felt ancient. Her dark blonde hair hung in matted strands around her face, unwashed for 2 weeks. Her blue-gray eyes were hollowed with exhaustion, ringed with dark circles that spoke of nights without sleep and days without hope. She wore a gray wool dress that had once been respectable, the kind a schoolteacher would wear. Now it was torn at the hem, stained with mud and things she didn't want to think about. A threadbare sweater covered her shoulders, but it was full of holes and provided almost no warmth. She had no coat. She'd lost it somewhere in the chaos of surrender, or perhaps someone had stolen it. She couldn't remember anymore. Her shoes were wooden-soled clogs that were falling apart, held together more by habit than by any remaining structural integrity. Thin cotton stockings covered her legs, but they were torn and provided no insulation against the cold. She had lost so much weight in the last months that her dress hung on her frame. Before the war's final collapse, before the food became scarce even for civilians, before everything fell apart, she had weighed 140 pounds. Now she was perhaps 110. Her body had consumed itself to stay alive. Greta Muller had been an elementary school teacher in Heidelberg before the war turned her world inside out. She had graduated from the teacher's seminary in 1939, full of hope and purpose, ready to shape young minds. She had married Klaus in 1940, a good man, a kind man who worked as a clerk in the university administration. They had been happy, in the way people can be happy even as the world darkens around them. Klaus was drafted in 1941. He wrote letters faithfully for 2 years, letters that grew shorter and darker as the Eastern Front consumed men like kindling in a fire. In 1943, the telegram came. Klaus Müller, killed in action near Kursk. No body to return, no grave to visit, just a telegram and a widow's pension that bought less each month as the currency collapsed. She had continued teaching because what else was there? The classrooms became emptier as fathers died and families fled the cities. The curriculum became stranger, darker, filled with propaganda that made her uncomfortable, but that she taught anyway, because not teaching it meant losing her position, and losing her position meant starvation. In early 1945, as the Americans pushed closer, even civilian women were conscripted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate scraping of Germany's barrel. Greta was assigned to auxiliary support, carrying messages, helping with logistics. She never fired a weapon, she never fought, but she was there when the American forces rolled through, and being there was enough. She surrendered with a group of other civilian auxiliaries 3 days ago. The German officers who processed their surrender had beaten them. Not the Americans, their own people, for the crime of choosing to live instead of fighting to the death. An SS officer whose name she never learned had screamed in her face, called her a traitor, a coward, a disgrace to her dead husband's memory. He had slapped her so hard her ear rang for hours afterward. She could still feel the ghost of that blow, and all through the beating, all through the screaming and the accusations, the American soldiers who took custody of them had simply watched, impassive, not interfering, but not participating either. They had loaded the prisoners onto trucks and driven them here. They had given them water. They had given them bread. They had not beaten them. They had not killed them. They had done nothing that the propaganda had promised they would do. It was confusing. It was terrifying in its own way. Because if the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that make the Germans who had told her they were? 15 other women sat in this section with her, all waiting for the same processing, the same tent assignment. Frau Hoffmann, perhaps 60 years old, who had run a small shop in Frankfurt before the war. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly, weeping in quiet, exhausted sobs. Helga, only 19, who had been a leader in the Hitler Youth, all sharp angles and defiance even now, sitting rigidly upright as if her spine might snap if she showed weakness. Liesel, 35, a mother of 3 who had been separated from her children in the chaos of evacuation. She alternated between periods of silent staring and moments of hysterical crying, calling out her children's names. Ingrid, 42, a nurse, the most practical of them all, moving among the women with quiet efficiency, checking on them, trying to keep spirits up, recognizing that survival now meant staying sane as much as staying alive. The American guards walked their patrols with rifles slung over their shoulders, most of them young, 19 or 20 or 22. They looked tired. They had been fighting for months, pushing across France and into Germany, seeing things no young man should see. They weren't cruel. They weren't kind. They were just doing their job. They spoke to each other in English, that harsh-sounding language full of sharp consonants that Greta couldn't understand. They smoked cigarettes. They ate from tin cans. They glanced at the prisoners occasionally with expressions that ranged from pity to discomfort to studied indifference. The rain began in earnest at 6:45 p.m., just as the last light faded from the sky. It started as a drizzle, light drops that were almost refreshing after the oppressive humidity of the day, but within minutes, the drizzle became a steady rain, and the steady rain became a downpour. The temperature dropped further. The wind drove the rain horizontally, cutting across the open field with nothing to stop it. Greta's thin dress was soaked through in less than 5 minutes. The fabric clung to her skin, offering no warmth at all, only the cold weight of water. Her hair plastered itself to her face and neck. Rain ran down her back, pooled in her lap, filled her wooden shoes until she was sitting in puddles. The shivering started almost immediately. First just a tremor, then a violent shaking she couldn't control. Her jaw clenched tight to keep her teeth from chattering, but it didn't help. She could hear them clicking together, a sound that seemed absurdly loud in her own head. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes. She tried to tuck her hands under her arms for warmth, but there was no warmth to be found anywhere on her body. The rain drummed on the canvas tents. It hissed in the mud. It roared in her ears until she could barely hear anything else. The world became gray and cold and wet. She could see the other women around her, all of them in the same desperate condition. Frau Hoffmann had curled into a ball on the ground, no longer crying, just lying there shaking. Helga still sat upright, pride keeping her spine straight, but her lips were turning blue, and her eyes had lost their defiant spark. Liesel rocked back and forth, her arms wrapped around herself, keening softly. Ingrid was trying to get the women to huddle together for warmth, her nurse's training telling her that hypothermia was a real danger now. But some of the women were too far gone in shock or despair to respond. Greta's teeth bit down on her lower lip hard enough to draw blood. The metallic taste mixed with the rain on her mouth. She was cold. So cold. Cold in a way she had never experienced. A cold that seemed to reach into her bones and freeze her from the inside out. This is how I die, she thought. Not in battle, not defending anything, just sitting in the mud, freezing to death because no one cares enough to give us shelter. Klaus died on a battlefield, I'll die like a drowned rat. The thought should have made her angry, but she was too tired, too cold for anger. There was only resignation, only the slow understanding that this was the end. The American guards had retreated to covered positions. They wore rain ponchos now, waterproof sheets of rubberized canvas that shed water like duck feathers. Some had moved to the guard towers where there were roofs. Others stood under the eaves of tents or administration buildings. They were staying dry. They were staying warm. The prisoners were not their concern. Orders were orders. The women would wait until morning for processing and shelter. That was protocol. No one had told the guards to move the prisoners out of the rain, so they didn't. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was just procedure, just following rules, just not caring enough to break them. Greta watched them through the rain, these young American soldiers who stood dry while she sat soaked. This is what we were told, she thought. They have no mercy. They have no humanity. The propaganda was right after all. We are nothing to them. Less than nothing. We are defeated enemies, and defeated enemies deserve no consideration. She could feel her core temperature dropping. The shivering was becoming less violent now, which she knew from somewhere in the back of her mind was a bad sign. When you stopped shivering, it meant your body was giving up the fight to stay warm. It meant hypothermia was setting in. It meant you were entering the stage where you would just fall asleep and not wake up. Around her, the other women were struggling in their own ways. Some prayed, some cried, some just sat in blank silence, staring at nothing. The rain showed no signs of stopping. The clouds above were thick and dark, promising hours more of this. The wind was picking up, making everything worse. Greta closed her eyes. Maybe if she just rested for a moment. Maybe if she just let herself drift. Maybe dying wouldn't be so bad. At least she would be with Klaus. At least she wouldn't be cold anymore. Then she heard the footsteps, heavy boots sucking through mud, the squelching sound of someone walking toward them. She opened her eyes, though it took effort. Through the rain, she could see a silhouette approaching, tall, over 6 feet, wearing a rain poncho, helmet on his head, rifle over his shoulder. An American guard. He was walking directly toward their section, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and rain. Greta's heart, which had been beating slowly, sluggishly, suddenly hammered in her chest. He was coming for them, for her. This was it, the moment the propaganda had warned about. She tried to make herself smaller, pressing back against the post. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was too weak to run anyway. The other women had noticed him too. Helga struggled to her feet, swaying, trying to summon some final defiance. Frau Hoffmann whimpered. Ingrid positioned herself in front of the weaker women, ready to protect them however she could. The guard's footsteps came closer. 30 feet away, 20 feet, 10 feet. Greta could see him more clearly now, though his face was shadowed by his helmet. He was young, she could tell that much. Tall and broad-shouldered with the build of someone who had done hard physical work before the army. He stopped directly in front of her, 3 feet away, looking down at her as she sat in the mud, shaking, soaked, dying by degrees. This is when it happens, she thought. This is when he kicks me, or shoots me, or drags me away to whatever fate they have planned. Her muscles tensed, preparing to run even though she knew she couldn't. Every nerve in her body screamed danger. The guard stood there for a long moment, rain streaming off his poncho. Then his hands moved to the fasteners at his throat. Greta flinched, expecting a blow, but his movements were slow, deliberate, non-threatening. He was unbuttoning his poncho. Why was he unbuttoning his poncho? The question made no sense. He shrugged the waterproof covering off his shoulders and let it fall to the ground beside him. Rain immediately began soaking into his uniform shirt. Then he reached for his coat, the olive drab wool field jacket that every American soldier wore. He was taking off his coat. He was removing his only protection against the rain and cold. Greta's mind couldn't process what she was seeing. It made no sense. It violated everything she understood about captors and prisoners, about enemies and conquered. He knelt in the mud beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. For the first time, she could see his face clearly. He was young, maybe 24 or 25. Sandy brown hair was visible under the rim of his helmet. His eyes were hazel, tired but kind. His face was earnest, unlined, the face of someone who had grown up far from war. There was no anger in his expression, no hatred, no lust, just concern. Just simple human concern for another person's suffering. He held his coat in both hands, opened it wide, and moved closer. Greta flinched again, instinct stronger than reason. He paused when he saw her flinch, waiting, giving her time to understand he meant no harm. Then gently, carefully, he draped the coat over her shoulders. The weight of it settled on her like a blanket. It was warm, still warm from his body heat. It was dry on the inside, though the outside was already getting wet. It smelled like wool and soap and something masculine and foreign and human. He pulled the edges of the coat together in front of her, making sure it covered her completely, his large hands careful not to touch her inappropriately. The sleeves hung down past her hands. The hem came nearly to her knees. It was enormous on her, meant for a man half a foot taller, but it was warm, it was protection, it was kindness. He was speaking now, in English, words she couldn't understand, but his tone was gentle, almost apologetic. The sounds washed over her like the rain, incomprehensible, but somehow comforting in their softness. He was looking at her face, at her eyes, seeing her as a person, as a human being who was suffering and needed help. Not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, not as something less than human, just as a person. Greta's mind was fragmenting. This wasn't possible. This wasn't what happened. Americans were supposed to be cruel. They were supposed to be monsters. That's what she had been taught, what everyone had been taught, what the propaganda had drilled into them for years. But this man, this enemy, this soldier who could have stayed dry and warm, had given her his coat, his own coat. He would be soaked now. He would be cold. He was choosing discomfort, choosing to suffer, so that she wouldn't have to. She couldn't speak. Her throat was closed. Her mind was screaming questions that had no answers. Why? Why would he do this? What does he want? What's the trick? But looking into his eyes, she saw no deception. Only kindness. Only humanity. He stood up, rising from his kneeling position. Mud covered his knees. Rain was already soaking through his uniform shirt. He looked down at her one more time, gave a small nod, a universal gesture that meant "you're okay now," and turned to walk back to his post. Greta watched him go, unable to move, unable to process, wrapped in his coat, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in a kindness she had never expected and didn't know how to accept. The coat was still warm. That was the first coherent thought Greta could form as she watched the American soldier disappear into the rain and darkness. His body heat was trapped in the wool fibers, radiating against her frozen skin. The sensation was almost painful, warmth meeting cold so suddenly that it felt like burning. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, her numb fingers fumbling with the fabric. The rain drummed on the wool exterior, but inside, against her body, she was protected. She was warm. She was alive. Around her, the other women were staring. Not at the departing soldier anymore, but at her, at the coat, at the impossible thing that had just happened. Ingrid was the first to move, crawling through the mud to kneel beside Greta. Her face was streaked with rain and tears, her nurse's composure cracking. "What did he say to you?" Ingrid asked in German, her voice shaking. "What did the American say?" Greta shook her head slowly. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know. I don't speak English. I didn't understand the words." "But he gave you his coat." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the rain. Why would an enemy soldier remove his own protection and give it to a prisoner? What logic explained that? What military doctrine? What propaganda narrative? None. There was no framework for understanding what had just happened. Helga was on her feet now, stumbling through the mud toward them. Her defiant posture was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. "It's a trick," she said, her voice high and strained. "It has to be a trick. He wants something. He'll come back later and demand payment." She spat the last word like poison, making her meaning clear. Greta looked up at the young woman, at her blue lips and shaking hands, at the fear barely hidden behind her anger. "Then why leave?" Greta asked quietly. "If he wanted that, why walk away? Why give me his coat and just leave?" Helga had no answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The logic didn't support her fear, and they both knew it. Frau Hoffmann reached out from where she lay, curled on the ground. Her aged hand, wrinkled and trembling, touched the edge of the coat. "May I?" she whispered. Greta nodded. The old woman's fingers stroked the wool reverently, as if it were something holy. "It's real," Frau Hoffmann breathed. "It's really happening. He really gave it to you." Her voice broke. "Mein Gott, maybe we'll be all right. Maybe we'll actually survive this." The words opened something in the group, some collective dam that had been holding back emotion. Several women began to cry, not the hopeless tears they had been shedding for days, but something different, something that might have been relief, might have been confusion, might have been the beginning of understanding that everything they thought they knew about their enemy was wrong. Liesel, the mother who had been separated from her children, spoke into the rain. Her voice was stronger than it had been in days. "If he's kind," she said slowly, working through the logic. "If that American is kind enough to give his coat to an enemy, then maybe wherever my children are, maybe the soldiers there are kind too." She couldn't finish the thought. Hope was too painful to voice completely after so much despair. But the others understood. They all understood. If kindness could exist here in this miserable camp, from this unexpected source, then maybe it existed elsewhere too. Maybe their families were safe. Maybe survival was possible. Maybe the future wasn't just darkness and death. The rain continued, but something had changed. The American guards who had been watching from their covered positions were moving now. Greta saw the red-haired sergeant in the guard tower speaking into his radio handset, his gestures animated. A few minutes later, other soldiers appeared carrying heavy canvas tarps. They began rigging them up over the prisoner section, using tent poles and rope to create makeshift shelters. It wasn't perfect. The rain still blew in from the sides, but it was something. It was more than they'd had. One of the soldiers, a stocky man with a thick mustache, brought a wooden crate and set it down near the women. He opened it to reveal tin cups and a large thermos. He poured something steaming into one of the cups and held it out to Greta. She took it with shaking hands. Coffee. Hot, bitter, American coffee. The warmth of the cup against her palms was almost as shocking as the coat had been. She brought it to her lips and sipped. The taste was harsh, nothing like the weak ersatz coffee she'd been drinking for years. But it was hot, and it was real, and it spread warmth through her chest like fire. The soldier moved through the group, pouring coffee for each woman, his movements efficient but not unkind. Then he brought crackers, hard military biscuits, and cans of something that he opened with a small device attached to his belt. Beef stew. The smell hit Greta like a memory from another life, rich and savory and real. Real meat, not the sawdust-filled bread and watery soup they'd been surviving on, not the potato peels and scraps. Actual food. The soldier handed out tin plates and spoons, and the women ate. Some wept as they ate. Some ate too fast and made themselves sick. Greta forced herself to go slowly, to let her shrunken stomach adjust to the sudden abundance. The food was salty and rich and foreign-tasting, but it was warm and filling, and it was the most magnificent thing she had ever tasted. Through all of this, wrapped in the American soldier's coat, Greta felt her mind beginning to thaw along with her body. The warmth wasn't just physical. Something inside her was shifting, cracking, breaking apart. The propaganda had been so certain, so absolute. Americans are animals. Americans are cruel. Americans will rape and murder and torture. Americans are the enemy of everything good and German. She had believed it. Not entirely, not with her whole heart, but enough. Enough to be terrified when she surrendered. Enough to expect the worst. Enough to prepare for death. But the soldier, Sullivan, his name had been stenciled inside the coat collar where she'd seen it. He had destroyed that certainty with one simple act. He had given her his coat, and then walked away. No demands, no expectations, no cruelty, just kindness. Just seeing another human being suffering and choosing to help. It was such a small thing. Just a coat. Just a few minutes of discomfort for him. But it had shattered her entire world view. "I taught children to hate Americans," Greta said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of rain and quiet eating. The other women looked at her. She was staring at nothing, at the darkness beyond their makeshift shelter. "I was a teacher, elementary school. After 1938, the curriculum changed. We had to teach certain things, about racial purity, about German superiority, about our enemies. I taught 8-year-olds that Americans were mongrels, racially impure, weak, cruel. I taught them these things because the textbook said to teach them, because not teaching them meant losing my position, because I told myself I was just doing my job." Her voice was hollow. "I had a student, Hannah Rosenthal. She was Jewish. This was 1938, before they banned Jewish children from schools. The other children bullied her because of what I taught them, what we all taught them. I stood by and let it happen. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. Hannah's father was taken during Kristallnacht. She disappeared after that. I never asked what happened to her. I just accepted it. I moved on. I taught the next lesson." The silence that followed was heavy. Ingrid spoke first, her voice rough. "I'm a nurse. I worked in a hospital in Munich. I saw what they did. The disabled patients who disappeared, the mentally ill who were transferred and never came back, the whispers about mercy killings. I knew, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just a nurse, that I couldn't change anything." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But silence is a choice too. Doing nothing is doing something." Helga's voice was small when she spoke, nothing like the defiant Hitler youth leader she'd been pretending to be. "I'm 19 years old. I don't remember life before the Nazis. Everything I know, everything I was taught, it's all lies, isn't it?" She looked around at the older women, pleading for someone to tell her it wasn't true, but no one could. "I led exercises for younger girls. I taught them songs about dying for the Führer. I made them memorize propaganda. I believed it all, every word. I was so sure, so certain we were right and everyone else was wrong." Her voice broke. "How could I have been so stupid?" "You weren't stupid," Frau Hoffmann said softly. The old woman had pulled herself into a sitting position, still shivering, but more present than she'd been in hours. "You were young. You were taught lies from birth. We all were, in different ways. I'm 63 years old. I lived through the First War. I knew better. My husband fought alongside Americans in 1918 before they were on opposite sides. He told me they were honorable men, fair men. When this war started, when the propaganda began, I told him he was wrong. I told him this war was different. These Americans were different. She closed her eyes. I should have listened to him. He died last year in an air raid. Before he died, he said to me, "The Americans aren't your enemy, Margaret. Your own leaders are." I thought he was being foolish, senile. I should have listened. Sachiko, one of the quieter women, spoke up. She'd been a secretary at the university in Heidelberg, working in the same building where Greta's husband had worked. I had colleagues who were Jewish, professors, administrators, good people, smart people. They lost their jobs in 1933. Some emigrated, some stayed, hoping it would get better. It didn't get better. I watched them be erased, one by one. I took one of their positions when it opened up. I told myself I needed the job. I told myself someone would have taken it anyway. I told myself I was just trying to survive. She looked at her hands. But I benefited from their suffering. I built my life on their destruction. How do I live with that? The confessions continued, each woman unburdening herself in the darkness and rain, each one carrying guilt, each one complicit in different ways. Some had been active participants, teaching hatred, enforcing rules, believing the propaganda. Others had been passive, looking away, staying silent, accepting the unacceptable because resistance seemed impossible or dangerous or futile. But all of them understood now, sitting under American tarps, wrapped in American generosity, fed with American rations, that they had been on the wrong side. Not because they had lost the war, but because they had been fighting for something evil, something cruel, something that made monsters of ordinary people. Greta pulled the coat tighter around herself. She could still feel Sullivan's warmth in the fabric, fading now, but still there. "He gave me his coat," she said quietly. "Private Sullivan. He didn't know me, didn't know if I was a Nazi or not, didn't know what I'd done or taught or believed. He just saw a person suffering, and he helped." She looked around at the other women. When did we stop seeing people? When did we start seeing enemies and subhumans and threats instead of just people? When did it become acceptable to look away from suffering? When did cruelty become normal? "When we let fear control us," Ingrid answered. "When we let others think for us. When we chose comfort over conscience." She leaned forward, her nurse's training making her check on each woman even now, making sure they were warm enough, fed enough, stable enough. But we're here now. We survived. The question is, what do we do with survival? Do we go back to Germany and pretend none of this happened? Do we keep our heads down and rebuild with the same old lies? Or do we choose differently? "Truth," Greta said firmly. The word came out stronger than she expected. "If I survive this, if I get to live, I'll teach truth. I poisoned children's minds with lies. I can't undo that. Those children are soldiers now, some of them, fighting and dying for the lies I helped put in their heads. But if I get another chance, I'll teach truth. I'll make sure the next generation knows what lies cost. I'll tell them about tonight, about the American soldier who gave me his coat, about the enemy who showed more humanity than our own people did." "I'll tell my children," Liesel said, her voice fierce with determination. "When I find them, when we're together again, I'll tell them the truth. No more propaganda, no more hate, just truth." The others nodded, murmuring agreement. It was a vow made in darkness and rain, under enemy tarps, wrapped in enemy generosity. A vow that felt sacred in its simplicity. They would survive. They would remember. They would tell the truth. They would make sure the next generation understood the cost of lies and the value of seeing every person, even your enemy, as human. The rain finally stopped sometime around 4 in the morning. Greta had dozed fitfully, never quite sleeping but never quite awake either, suspended in that exhausted space between consciousness and dreams. When dawn began to break at 6:15 a.m. on April 19th, 1945, she opened her eyes to a world transformed by light. The sky was clearing, patches of pink and gold visible between the dispersing clouds. The sun was rising over the destroyed German landscape, and despite everything, despite the ruins and the defeat and the uncertain future, it was beautiful. Mist rose from the wet earth in ghostly columns. Birds that had survived the battle and the storm were singing their morning songs. The air smelled clean, washed free of smoke and dust and despair. The camp was stirring to life around them. American soldiers emerged from their barracks, yawning and stretching. The smell of breakfast cooking drifted across the compound. Eggs and bacon and coffee, smells that made Greta's stomach clench with hunger even after last night's stew. Engines started, generators hummed, the machinery of occupation ground into motion for another day. A loudspeaker crackled to life. An American voice barked something in English, harsh and incomprehensible. Then a German translator followed. All prisoners report for processing. Form orderly lines at the administration tent. You will be assigned to transport shortly. The women stirred, helping each other to their feet. They were stiff and sore, still damp despite the tarps, but alive. Greta stood carefully, Sullivan's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She had clutched it all night, afraid to let it go, afraid that losing it would mean losing the warmth, the protection, the proof that kindness had actually happened. She saw him then. Sullivan, walking across the compound with other guards, reporting for the morning shift. In full daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with the broad shoulders and sturdy build of someone who'd grown up doing farm work. His sandy brown hair was visible now that he wasn't wearing his helmet. His face was young, unlined except for the tired shadows under his hazel eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept, and she realized he probably hadn't. He'd given her his coat. He'd spent the night cold and wet because of that choice. The thought made her throat tighten. He was walking toward the prisoner section, his eyes scanning the women. Looking for her, looking for his coat. Their eyes met across 30 feet of muddy ground. He stopped. She stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other in the morning light. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile of relief. She was okay. That's what the smile said. You survived the night. You're okay. He changed direction, walking toward her now. Greta's heart pounded, but it was a different kind of fear than last night. Not fear of violence, fear of inadequacy. How did you thank someone for saving your life? What words existed in any language to express what his coat had meant? He stopped 3 feet away, maintaining that respectful distance. Up close, she could see how exhausted he was. His uniform shirt was still damp. He was shivering slightly in the morning cold, but his expression was gentle, concerned, checking on her like a doctor checking on a patient. He spoke in English, his voice soft. "Good morning. Did you stay warm enough? I need to get my coat back now, but I'm glad it helped." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the gesture he made, pointing at the coat, pointing at himself. He needed it back. Of course he did. It was his coat. He had a job to do, a day to get through, and he needed his uniform. She nodded quickly, shrugging the coat off her shoulders. The cold hit her immediately, making her gasp, but she forced herself to smile, to show him she was okay. She held the coat out to him with both hands, offering it like a gift, like something precious being returned to its rightful owner. Their hands touched as he took it, both of them holding the coat for just a moment. His hands were large and calloused, scarred from combat and work. Her hands were small and thin, trembling slightly. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Recognition, understanding, shared humanity. "I see you," both pairs of eyes said. "You're not my enemy. You're just a person." "Danke," Greta said, her voice breaking on the word. "Danke schön. Thank you. Thank you so much." She tried to pack everything she felt into those 2 words, all the gratitude and confusion and transformation and hope. She wanted him to understand that he hadn't just kept her warm. He'd changed something fundamental in her understanding of the world. He'd broken through years of propaganda with one simple gesture. He'd given her more than a coat. He'd given her truth. He nodded, understanding the word even if he didn't understand the depth of emotion behind it. "You're welcome," he said in English. He put the coat back on, buttoning it, settling it on his shoulders. Then he reached into one of the pockets and pulled out a chocolate bar, one of those American Hershey bars she'd heard about but never tasted. He held it out to her. "For you. For later." She took it with shaking hands, staring at it like it was treasure. In a way it was. It represented abundance, generosity, the casual kindness of giving more even when you'd already given so much. She looked back up at him, tears filling her eyes. She couldn't speak. She just nodded over and over, trying to convey everything she couldn't say. He touched the brim of his helmet, a casual salute, a goodbye. Then he turned and walked back toward his post. After a few steps, he glanced back over his shoulder. She was still watching him. He raised his hand in a small wave, informal and friendly. She raised her hand too, returning the gesture. It was the first friendly gesture she'd made to an American. It felt monumental, like crossing a bridge she could never uncross. He smiled one more time, and then he was gone, swallowed by the morning bustle of the camp. Processing took most of the day. Medical screenings, interviews, paperwork. A German-American corporal named Hoffman conducted Greta's interview. When she asked why the Americans were being kind, he looked at her for a long moment. "Why wouldn't we be? War is almost over. You're not soldiers. You're just people now. Just people." The simplicity of it was staggering. They were just people. Not enemies, not Nazis, not subhumans. Just people who'd been caught up in something terrible and now needed help. They were transported that afternoon to a larger facility. The truck convoy drove through a Germany Greta barely recognized. Every village was in ruins. Refugees walked the roads in endless streams. American military vehicles were everywhere, thousands of them, a river of machines that spoke to resources Germany had never possessed. How had they ever thought they could win? Days turned into weeks. April became May. May became June. Greta worked in the camp library, teaching informal English classes. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Hitler was dead, the concentration camps had been liberated, and the photographs that circulated through the camp showed horrors that made Greta physically sick. This is what we did, she thought, what we allowed by our silence. On July 10th, the trucks came to take them home. Greta stood in the loading area with her small bundle of possessions, waiting for the future to begin. And then she saw him one last time, Sullivan, walking past with a clipboard. Their eyes met across the compound. With courage she didn't know she possessed, Greta walked toward him. She'd learned some English in the weeks at camp. She stopped in front of him and spoke carefully. "Hello, you Sullivan? I Greta. You give coat? I remember. You good man? Thank you. Thank you for life." His face broke into a surprised smile. "You learned English." "You're welcome, Greta. I'm glad you're okay. Good luck back home." He extended his hand, and she shook it. What she wanted to say but couldn't express? "You changed everything." One coat broke a wall of lies. What he wanted to say but didn't have words for. "I just did what felt right. You're not my enemy, just a person." But they understood each other anyway. She nodded goodbye. He nodded back. Then she turned and walked to the truck, climbed aboard and left the camp behind. But took the memory with her, took the lesson with her, took the truth with her. Years later, in 1968, Greta Muller would stand in front of a classroom in Heidelberg, 51 years old and still teaching. One student asked about American cruelty to German prisoners. Greta shook her head. "Let me tell you a different story," she said. "About a night in April 1945, about a rainstorm and a coat." She told them about Private James Sullivan giving her his coat, choosing to be cold so she wouldn't have to be. He didn't have to do that, she told her students. No one ordered him. He just saw a person suffering and chose to help. That one act changed how I saw everything. That American soldier, I never saw him again after we said goodbye. But I think of him every day, every time I teach you, every time I choose truth over lies. Hatred is taught, compassion is a choice. And sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of human decency. One girl asked, "Do you still have the coat?" Greta smiled sadly. "No, it was his coat. I gave it back the next morning. But I carry it with me anyway, every day. In here." She touched her chest, over her heart. "Some gifts you carry forever, not because you kept the object, but because they changed who you are. Private Sullivan gave me more than warmth that night. He gave me truth. He gave me a reason to do better. And I've spent every day since trying to pass that gift forward to every student I teach. Choose kindness. Choose truth. Choose to see the humanity in everyone, even those you're told to hate. That's how we make sure the horrors of the past never happen again." On April 18, 1945, a young American soldier gave his coat to an enemy prisoner. That single act cost him nothing but a cold night. But it gave Greta Muller everything. Private James Sullivan went home to Iowa, married his sweetheart Betty, ran the family farm, and lived until 1987. He rarely spoke about the war, but Greta spoke about him constantly for 44 years until her death in 1989. She taught truth. She taught compassion. She taught that one act of kindness can echo through generations. One choice, one coat, one rainy night. Infinite consequences. That's the real story worth remembering.